Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody has been enjoying the wonderful programming on this closing day of the National News Literacy Week. Welcome to extra special panel discussion, exploring how can the news media repair its trust problem with marginalized communities, brought to you by NBCU. Joining us today are journalists from NBC News and Telemundo. These journalists cover a range of beats and subject areas and are here today to talk about the issue of trust in their work. I'm Demario Phipps-Smith, the Senior Manager of Community Learning at the News Literacy Project, and I'd like to thank all of you all for joining us in this discussion. Before we begin, though, I'd like to address a few housekeeping points. First of all of today's webinars are being recorded and they will be shared along with a list of resources mentioned today that will be in a follow-up email available sometime next week. Also, watch for notifications to complete our brief survey. It contains a link. It also contains a link to the audience certification for educators looking for the credit. Lastly, please use the chat function for general discussion. We ask that you use the Q&A function to pose questions to the panel, which they'll get to as best as possible. We will also be using the general chat function to drop links to resources and tools for educators. And so with that, I would love to introduce our moderator, NBC News Now correspondent, Zinhle Essamuah. Zinhle, welcome.
Thank you so much, Demario, and welcome everyone. As he mentioned, my name is Zinhle Essamuah. I'm a correspondent with NBC News Now and NBC News proper. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm joining you from San Francisco on the ancestral lands of the Ohlone people. And today we're talking about underserved communities and how we report on them well and respectfully. I am joining you from a communal coffee shop, so excuse any background noise you hear from me. I'm reporting. And this is an exciting time because NBCU is actually celebrating its second anniversary. It's a journalism and media training program, and currently it's in 45 colleges and universities. So thank you for being a part of our conversation today. It's no secret how the media relates to underserved communities is a complicated relationship. And so we want to dig in with you today on how we do it, and the ways we get it right and the ways we want to improve. So I want you to meet our panelists. I'll ask them all to just give a wave when I say your name. I'm joined by Belén Smole. She's Telemundo 62 anchor in Philadelphia. Chiara Sottile, NBC News reporter and producer. Guad Venegas, NBC News correspondent. Jamie Nguyen, NBC News Consumer Investigations senior producer. Jamie also executive produced the Racism Virus specials on NBC News Now. And Tracy Ayers, executive editor of NBC News Race, Equality, and Justice Unit. We've got a lot of different perspectives today, so I'm excited for you to hear them. And just to start, and I also want to remind the audience, feel free to submit any questions you have. We want this to be interactive as well, and I'll incorporate those into the discussion. So for each of you, can you first just tell our audience a bit about yourself, what you do, and how you got into this work? So Tracy, let's start with you.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. As Zinhle mentioned, I'm executive editor of the newly created Race, Equality, and Justice Unit at NBC News. And what that means is we work across all platforms, which includes MSNBC, streaming, News Now, digital, audio, Peacock even. We've worked with CNBC, and we do a variety of things, whether it's pitching stories that we're seeing that should be told, working with colleagues on scripting, and also flagging different platforms on things they should be covering that they're missing. And it's truly a collaboration. And, you know, we like to say we're the team that holds people accountable and just make sure we're telling the stories that should be told.
Thanks so much. Belén?
Let me unmute myself. So yeah, I'm Belén Smole. I'm a news anchor with Telemundo 62 here in Philadelphia. Prior to coming to Philadelphia, I was an investigative reporter, general assignment reporter in Houston, Denver, Albuquerque, so a little bit of everywhere. I was born and raised in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Came to the States 6 years ago to do my master's And I started working here since then, covering the Latino immigrant community, as well as other underserved communities. And yeah, it's truly something that I felt passionate for even since I was in college.
Wonderful. Thank you. Chiara? And sorry, Chiara, I think you're muted, so we'll give you a moment to get set up. Jamie?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jamie Nguyen, Senior Producer for the Consumer Investigative Unit, creator and executive producer of the Racism Virus. I am so excited to be here right now because I think it is such a pleasure and privilege to kind of talk to an audience of teachers and educators, because I think that you guys are our lifeline. Personally, I have a sixth grader, and I think it's so important for her to understand that you always have to question what you're hearing. You know, she'll come to me and say, Mom, I saw this on YouTube and it's something super ridiculous. And I'm always asking her questions like, where did you hear that from? How do you know that person is right? And so these are things that we have to build into the next generation, because there's so much misinformation out there. There's so many people on a campaign to disrupt information and knowledge. And so what you do is so key in the survival of just intelligence and just people asking questions. And let me circle back to what I do in a sense of, you know, as a consumer investigative producer, we look at a lot of like health and safety. Like during the pandemic, we talked to people about how to live their lives safely. So it's important, and it's important to see representation in all the work that we do.
Jamie, thank you so much. Chiara?
Hi, sorry, I'm Chiara Sottile. I'm a producer and reporter for NBC News, which means I get to tell stories on platforms like Nightly News and The Today Show, plus News Now and MSNBC. I am also the co-founder and co-leader of our Indigenous ERG here at NBC Universal, and a member of the Karuk tribe in Northern California. Really great to be with you all today.
Thank you so much. And Guad?
Hey guys, I'm Guad Venegas. I'm an NBC News correspondent out of the Miami Bureau. I cover all of Latin America and the region in the Southeast. I used to work out of the LA Bureau. Before working for NBC News, I was a correspondent for Telemundo Network for a few years. Also did local news in San Diego along the US-Mexico border, which the affiliates that are on the border for Telemundo actually cover part of Mexico as well because of the way the market works. So it's kind of like a funky place to be in, where we see, I guess, another dynamic community, which is sort of part of the American community, and it's considered also underserved. Anyhow, I'm from Southern California, from, I guess, what is considered an underserved, low-income community. Both my parents were undocumented migrants that came to the U.S. like thousands of people who are in this country. So for me, this is a great opportunity because the communities that we will be speaking about are just like the community that I come from. So to be on this side of things and to work as an NBC News correspondent, it's a powerful thing to go back into communities that are a lot like the one I grew up in, and look at it with a different perspective and with all the tools that we learn through schooling experiences and, of course, working for a company like NBC News. So I'm really excited to be here.
Well, thank you all for making the time and sharing your perspectives. I'd be remiss not to acknowledge the heavy news week that we're in, both as an industry and as a country, both with the Monterey Park shooting and the many mass shootings we've seen in the country this week, as well as the news out of Tennessee and the video we're expecting later tonight. So I actually want to start on those topics with both Tracy and Jamie, because I know you do work specifically in these spaces. So Jamie, I want to start with you. You know, the recent years, we've seen a surge in anti-Asian hate, both with the coronavirus and also violence, whether on the streets and now, as we've seen, in the form of mass shootings. What should our audience understand today about how we attempt to cover these stories well, and what should folks keep in mind when reporting on topics like this?
You know, I think that it's important that, you know, if you look at this panel, our newsrooms need to reflect the community that they serve. So whether, you know, it's someone's like sexual identity or who they, you know, their ethnic identity, those are all people who are out in the community, and there are people on the inside trying to represent those voices. And as, you know, I started watching all these videos surface about the attacks on Asian Americans. And it wasn't something that was talked about in the newsroom yet. But as someone who had as someone who is part of that community, things that my family was talking about, I felt like I was in a privileged position. As a consumer person, I have to know the consumer beat. But as an Asian American, I kind of had to highlight what's going on in the Asian American community. And working in television, it's a visual medium. So as these videos came out, my brother, my mom, they're sending me texts and video of these videos. And so that's when I really said, I'm in a position where I need to shine a light on this. I'm in editorial meetings and I need to tell folks who aren't aware about this. And so you kind of have to be able to use all your senses to bring attention to things. And I hate to say this, but sometimes I am the only Asian American in an editorial meeting, and they completely had no idea that this was happening. So I had to break it down to them and say, this fear is real, it's happening. And I kind of have to remember that, like, if they're asking me questions about it, I can't be defensive about it. It's not their fault that they don't know necessarily, because they're not connected in the community. So I find it that it's a responsibility for me to be able to speak up on these issues. I think for a long time, I've said this before, I didn't want to be like the Asian American woman journalist. I just wanted to be a journalist. But I think that it's important for us to bring all of us to these meetings and to these stories that we tell. It's what gives the stories layers and textures. There's a lot of nuances. And the Monterey Park shooting, I think, when you think about it, there's a huge language barrier and there is distrust. So the community wants to see people that look like them. Small things matter, like how to pronounce a name correctly. All these things add up and they help build credibility. They want to see people that look like them tell their stories. And that's not to say that someone else like Guad couldn't tell the same story, or Zinhle couldn't tell the same story, but there are small little nuances that maybe they might be willing to come up to me if I'm out on the street because I look like their sister or their mom or their auntie. So those things really matter. And I think organizations are really waking up to that and realizing that we need to reflect the communities that we serve.
Absolutely. And also viewing those identities as an asset. It's interesting hearing you talking about, you work in the consumer space, but you having your background was an asset and gave you that background and information. Tracy, I did want to, of course, talk about this news out of Tennessee, but in the context of the many sort of racial reckoning moments our country has had over the last decade. And I know specifically your unit was created in response to the murder of George Floyd. Have you seen a shift in how journalists cover these issues and how maybe we as an industry deal with a lot of this graphic content?
Well, it's very interesting as I was thinking about this, because this unit was created in the wake of George Floyd and the racial reckoning, and many media outlets were, realizing what Jamie had pointed out of the lack of representation, and employees within teams across newsrooms around the country were realizing their voices weren't heard and they were speaking out. And from all of that, the Race, Equality, and Justice Unit was created to, hold people accountable, but also give people across different platforms a place to come to talk about what's happening, and for our unit to help their stories come through. And so, when I look at the timing, it's, kind of 3 years later from George Floyd, and here we are, and it's kind of a full circle moment for our unit, because here, today I was watching the news conference of Tyre Nichols' mother, and it was was the exact same situation where it's a video, it's police, it's, someone crying out for their mother. And so, yes, we have come really far as a news organization holding police accountable. And, one thing that the legal team pointed out were it's activists and it's social media and protesters that help bring justice faster. And we still have a lot of work to do, but as a news organization, we also respond faster to telling these stories and listening to what people are saying on social media and listening to what employees are saying. As Jamie said, it was her speaking out that pushed a story forward. And so there's a lot more people speaking out from all different backgrounds, all different communities that are pushing stories forward and getting these stories told. So, as far as police accountability, it's still a work in progress. But as far as telling stories that underserved communities represent, those communities aren't often told, we're in a much better place.
And it seems that the pulse around internal mindfulness around when we're covering this stuff has also, you know, I might say improved, but I could even say today I was in a meeting, right, where as they assign stories and we're saying we're going to have to cover Tennessee tonight. If anyone thinks it's too much going through those videos, let us know. So the atmosphere has definitely shifted a bit. And Guad, Chiara, I know you both have done a lot of work on the ground in the field, right? And we heard from Tracy and Jamie a bit about the need to build trust and how identities can allow us to do that. Guad, maybe let's start with you. First, what do you think has led to some of this distrust we've seen from these communities and between them and the media? And what hurdles have you faced reporting on the ground? And then Chiara, I'll bring you in.
I mean, there's so many things that have happened over the years in America that have led communities to not trust what they see on TV. I'll give you an example with the Latino community. There's the use of the term illegals, or even like the US government at some point determined that someone who's not American is considered an alien. And then the old green cards would say resident alien. And so somehow that trickled down into calling illegal aliens undocumented individuals were illegal aliens. So there was sort of like the understanding that they were just not good people. And so then in these communities, when they saw anything on TV, you know, I remember as a little kid learning how to speak English, because, you know, you grow up in a Spanish speaking community and you learn English as a kid. At some point, I learned that my parents by then were residents, but I learned that they were aliens. They were resident aliens, or I was like, why are they aliens? And it's sort of like you grow up with this mindset that America has been designed to exclude you from the model of what is pretty in America and what is sort of mainstream. So it's been changing. I think that incorporating diverse community in the news is a big deal. Representation is huge, Seeing someone on TV who speaks like you, who looks like you, and who truly understands your community is very important. I grew up seeing a lot of people that didn't look like me, even in Spanish-speaking news in America. Most of the people that are on TV traditionally, because of a language reason, would come from, you know, other countries, and very few people or Latinos from this country actually made it on TV. But there's a number of reasons why this happened. But this is all changing, and I guess what I'm saying is representation from these communities is now there. So that's slowly changing. And I think just understanding what these communities go through and that they are completely different for every journalist is so important. When we go into these communities, we have to just tap into our human side and find common ground. In my experience, not all journalists try to find that common ground. And I mean, for me, it's easy because I grew up in these communities. So a lot of the times when we go into what people consider, I guess, a bad neighborhood, I'm like, oh, this is exactly what I grew up with. So it's much easier to connect with these individuals. But I find myself working with people that want to put on a face mask and gloves before they go speak to undocumented migrants. I'm like, why are you doing that? And it's like, we're human, they're human. Let's just have a human conversation. At the end of the day, you know, we find the truth, we deliver the news as best as we can, trying to stick to the right sources. And that's the service we provide. But we do it as humans. And if we just follow the principles of journalism, and we remind ourselves when we go into this community that they're a community just like any of the other ones we've been to, but with a lot more misinformation that is going into that community, a lot more obstacles that they have to deal with. I mean, I could just talk forever, but just keeping that on our mind, that when we go into these communities, it's completely different. It's much more complicated than going to report on a wealthy, educated community where people have a clear understanding what the news is, what a journalist is supposed to be doing, and misinformation doesn't affect them as much. So that's sort of how I see it.
Yeah, and we'll definitely get into the misinformation bit. And even hearing you talk about the mask portion, I think is a good reminder that sometimes we can create the barriers if we're not careful. It's not just the communities who may have some hesitations. Chiara, what about you? What do you feel has led to some mistrust in the media between underserved communities and the media? And also, how have you overcome some of those hurdles in your reporting?
Yeah, what Guad said really resonates with me too, that idea of America designed to exclude us. I think reporters, we have to remember that we're following in the footsteps of other journalists, and that might mean overcoming some stories that really did a disservice to these communities. Like Guad said, it's a really complicated community to cover, because especially for Indigenous folks, we're not a monolith. You know, there are hundreds of tribes with distinct governance and cultures and languages, and you really have to do your homework going into those communities in order to not follow in some of the poor reporting that has come before us. And so frankly, I think some of that distrust is deserved, because a lot of Indigenous communities have had our stories told, to borrow a phrase, without us, about us, meaning, you know, our narratives have been told for us without Indigenous voices. And certainly what you said about a lack of representation is part of what makes that happen. And having people of color in your newsroom is certainly going to help. But, you know, folks are frankly tired of being portrayed in the same tropes of either the gallant Native American warrior or the poverty-stricken reservation. For starters, not all Native folks live on a reservation or even grew up on one. So making sure that your reporting doesn't just follow those stereotypes. There's even the Native American Journalists Association has a bingo card for stories about Native America. And the goal is actually to not select the boxes on the bingo card. It's like, if you have ceremonial music in your story, like, whoa, you're headed towards a stereotype. Or if you rattle on about all these terrible statistics of all the poverty in your community, like, whoops, you've selected a bingo card. So I think really pushing yourself to go deeper than just that surface level stereotype is the first step towards doing better. And then the more you do that good coverage, the more someone's going to trust you and really want to tell you their story.
That's so good. Like pressing in, going deeper, and also being aware both of the stereotypes and perhaps your own biases too is really critical. Belén, I do want to bring you in. You know, I know you work in a bilingual newsroom in Philadelphia. What does it look like for you to report on underserved communities at the local level? And what does it require that maybe a lot of people don't think about?
Sure. So I think what you said is crucial, right? Be aware. And I kind of defined like 4 points that I thought about, and I'm going to, explain them as I go. I would say we're not just informing at the local level, we're translating, we're being of assistance, we have to put everything in context and also compare. So when I talk about translation, I want to say a very high percentage, probably, over 90% of the people that I met while covering out in the streets, in the field, didn't know English. And, their only language is Spanish, or they knew very little English. And you become sort of a translator for them when it comes to contracts, when it comes to government information, any sort of thing that they need help with, and they go to you because they trust you and they know that you're bilingual. Also during COVID, we are not professional translators, but we had all these press conferences done all around the country about, what the situation was with COVID. And we had the huge responsibility to be translating those live for our audience. Meaning that, for me, it was a huge, kind of responsibility in a situation like COVID was, in translating everything that medical experts were saying, president, mayors, whatever it was. That's when it comes to translation. We were doing all of that, and we still do that every day. A lot of the information comes in English, so it does require you to be bilingual, even if you are at a Spanish speaking station. When it comes to assistance, a lot of our folks, many of them don't have access to internet, or a few of them, I should say. And if they do, they don't know how to navigate the system. Is something, or the internet, and also the system as a country, because they're coming from a different system, right? And when you go out in the street, they do trust you a lot in which way, you can help them out. Sometimes they're not even stories that we can put on air because it's not something news related, but they come to you and they expect you to help them in some sort of way. What I personally do is just take some time off, even if it's not, something that we're going to put on air, but, give them the contact information for the Attorney General's office, for a nonprofit that can help them out. If they have the requirements to, legalize their situation with immigration, like, just put them in touch with nonprofits that have kind of courses to help them through the process. And then just going back to those four things I said, context and comparison, I think it's crucial. When we're talking about, for example, I'm going to bring back the COVID example, right? We started saying stay home, right? Like it was kind of the slogan the authorities were giving us. And it was kind of a wave at the beginning of the pandemic. We all said stay home. And then that quickly backfired on us. We were getting very nasty comments on social media, even in the field of our community, saying it is easy for you to say stay home when you still have a paycheck. If I don't go out and work, I don't have anything to feed my kids with. And that kind of made us think outside of the box and be like, well, we are looking detached from our community. We have to understand where they're coming from and what the reality is, and still have to balance that out with the recommendation that the experts and the government is doing. So the bread and butter of our newscast became where you can find free COVID tests, where you can find free food, assistance to pay your bills or your rent, and how can we be of help to our community during times like this. And then finally, when we talk about comparison, jumping back to the COVID example, why it was really try to understand why it was hitting Hispanics more than their white counterparts. Well, because they don't work from a computer, right? At home, they had to go out and work in restaurants, in cleaning, like they had to go out there and work get their paychecks and everything. So try to understand why it was that they were being more affected by the pandemic, and also because they didn't have health insurance. So it was a reality that we were encountering every day we would go out. People that, were probably infected, but they just waited home because they didn't have the means to go to a hospital and get the care that they needed. So they would just wait it out until it was too late. And then, kind of go into the hospital at the last minute, and it was too late for the doctors to do anything. So I would say those four things.
Yeah, I mean, Belén, it sounds like part of what you're talking about is that our role as journalists is not just to provide the context, but understand the context that the communities we're reporting on are coming from. And I think one of the hardest obstacles to that can be the nature of news, right? A lot of us are coming in and out. We're covering breaking stories. We're on the way to the airport, as I am. And I know, Guad, you recently were in El Paso covering the end to Title 42, which, if you're not familiar, allows the US government to turn away asylum seekers. And that story is about policy, but it's also about people, Guad, right? So how do you approach asylum seekers in a setting like this who may be wary of journalists and cameras, but also how do you deal with the potential stigmas around parachuting in to a crisis and coming to report?
Oh, so many things. I will say, when it comes to situations like these, personally, it's fairly easy because my dad did the same thing 30 something years ago. So I found myself having these conversations with individuals of what the history has been for immigrants in the US. But I think as a journalist, when you report, and one of the things that I'm sure Belén has run into, the communities, Latino communities, expect journalists to sort of work like activists. And in these underserved communities, local governments don't do as good of a job as they do in a nice city. That's just how it is, right? The people aren't in touch all the time with the representatives that can help them. So you've got communities that are underserved, that have this disconnect with the police. We all know that in a lot of cities, most kids grow up thinking that the police officers are the bad people. And I mean, these are just the things we all know about. So with all of that happening, activists become very important to these communities. And when we come in to report, we have to understand how important activists are. Every time I go to the border, I think anyone that's reported at the border with immigrants, you realize how important the activists are to connect with them, but also to make it clear to all the people that we're speaking to that as journalists, we're here to report, but not to be activists and not to get involved. And that does upset some people, but what we offer is truth, and we offer reliable information. I think that that's something that in a lot of these underserved communities, a lot of people don't understand how valuable it is to have reliable information. And that's one of the things I told them, because a lot of the migrants in El Paso, the majority of them were from Venezuela. And there's a few others that came from other countries, but the majority for this particular assignment were Venezuelan. And they got all their news through Facebook. and WhatsApp groups. There's a big thing with the Latino communities where people will send a message on WhatsApp, a meme, a screenshot, and that screenshot will be misinterpreted and shared with everyone, or they'll have a video that's 4 years old and someone will say, no, this happened yesterday with the raid with immigration. And so that's how misinformation spreads. So as we report, a lot of us, this is my colleagues from Telemundo, I work very close because I also work at Telemundo. We're reporting, interviewing, and teaching people where to get the news. And so that's a very important thing for me when I go into these communities. And I've done the same thing when I was in Jackson, Mississippi, predominantly Black community, where they had the water problems. You talk to them, where are you getting your news? Who told you that this is all being, someone in Jackson's like, the federal government is doing this on purpose because they don't want, I was like, wait, where are you getting this from? And so to spend 5 minutes and go through their phone where they show me where they get their news from, I'm like, why don't you install this app? Look at, these are the news sources that you can rely on, and obviously I work for NBC News, so I'd like NBC News is there, but you want something that's not NBC News, go on NPR, look at it. He's like, oh, I've never done that. They follow pages where it's like an activist that's always posting videos. I'm like, that is good, but sometimes they're going to make a mistake. And like the one thing you believed in that you wanted to argue with me about this morning, I believe that's a mistake. So it's very important to talk to people about where they should be getting their news. And then finally, I'd like to say the human. Yeah. When we go into these communities, we're talking to people just like us. And if we as journalists can put ourselves in their place, I don't know, just connect on a human level. We all have parents, we all have kids, we all have necessities. And I know it's something simple, but it's not always done. But when you do that and you have a human conversation with them, it's easier to have them open up. It's easier to tell their story, and it's easier to stay in touch with them, as opposed to like, I don't know. I personally, as somebody that comes from a community like that, I've seen journalists that come and look at the people they're interviewing as exhibit A, and it's body language. It's the way they approach it. And of course, there's language barriers that could make it difficult and other things, but just, we should all, as journalists, be reminded when we go into these communities, like immigrant communities, look into the human inside of you and try to connect on a human level with this person before you start asking the questions, before you hit them with this, before you turn on the camera.
Yeah.
And personally, it always works out once we find that human connection. So
that's so good. And a reminder of, language is not the only form of communication, body language too. And I do see people in the chat asking about some of the guides and resources. A lot of groups like the Native American Journalists Association have guides, and of course we'll compile those for you. Feel free to ask any questions you have in the chat. The word misinformation naturally has come up a few times. So Chiara, I did want to ask you, can you maybe give us an example of a story where you dismantled misinformation or misconceptions about an underrepresented community?
Sure. I think what Guad said is so important, meeting people where they are. And that it also is really important, of course, to be in social media spaces where people are getting their news. So a lot of the Native community may not be watching NBC network news, but they're on TikTok, for example. Actually, Tracy's unit did a really good job monitoring TikTok, and it actually led to a story that I got to do on the Navajo Nation about the price of groceries when we were having, so-called, food inflation, but it was so much worse in Arizona where we went. So I think that point about making sure that you're meeting people where they are, and certainly coming to them with treating them as a human being is so important. But on the misinfo and disinformation front, I saw a lot of that in the COVID pandemic as well. In particular, when we would start doing interviews, you have to actually realize it's a totally different word in a lot of these native languages. And so the first step was literally figuring out, how are we even talking about this virus in these different communities where we're visiting, right? So you really have to go and make sure that, again, like you're speaking the same language person to person. But also, I think one thing that I have learned is there's such value in going back to people you've met before, even if they told you no the first time. This makes me think of like Standing Rock, the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. A lot of people I approached at first actually declined my interview request because of the distrust of like, who the heck are you? Why would I tell you? Why would I talk to you? And I stuck around. I was there sleeping in the same blizzard for days that they were, right? And they eventually would come back up to me and say, okay, I know you're here, you're invested. And I'll trust you, and let's do this. But a lot of the live streams that went out from Standing Rock on like some of the activists' cell phones, like Guad talked about, they were really inflammatory. They were really helpful to some degree. But again, it's not the same listening to somebody's live streaming commentary as a journalist who is going to go back and make sure that what's being reported is actually what's going down. And of course, having the resources to be on the ground in Standing Rock was and is a huge privilege of working for NBC News, and one that I take really seriously, and I think there's no substitute for it. So yeah, that certainly is one way to combat misinformation. But on the other side, there's plenty of misconceptions that I think journalists have about Native communities that we also have to combat. And like you said earlier, about our own personal biases and making sure we're doing our homework up front.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really critical. Thank you so much. And I know, Chiara, you were talking about Standing Rock. That was like a breaking news event, but also an ongoing event. Guad, you were talking about Title 42. Belén, you're talking about reporting on local stories. But unless it's breaking news, many of the stories actually come from pitches, from correspondents or anchors like yourselves, or from producers like Tracy and Jamie. So Tracy and Jamie, I wonder, could you peel back the curtain a bit on how you pitch stories and bring attention to issues that maybe are not getting coverage? And then as you're doing that, like, how are you establishing rapport in those communities as well? I know a lot of questions in one, but we have such tight time and so many good things to get into. So Jamie, let's start with you.
I'll keep it quick. With the Asian American hate, because no one else was experiencing it, they had no idea. So I kind of had to put it in terms that they understood. I had to personalize it for them. And the way I did it in my first meeting, I said, guys, I'm going to be real with you for a second, and I'm going to tell you something very personal. I live in New York City on the Upper West Side, very diverse, but for the first time in my life, I am scared. I feel self-conscious walking the streets. I've had people cough on me, like it's like the parting of the Red Sea when they see me, because all they see are my eyes, and they equated me with the COVID virus. And I'm scared. Frankly, I'm worried about my mom who lives in Los Angeles. These feelings are real, and they deserve to be talked about and discussed. And I think that's when it hit home for them, because you connect to people you know and love. So Jamie's one of us, and if Jamie's feeling this, then it must be happening. So sometimes you kind of have to use the tools you have to make that connection. Sometimes it has to happen even inside your newsroom, your own newsroom. And again, I don't fault them. They don't know, but in order for the message to really hit home, you need to figure out different ways for them to receive the message. And if you can personalize it, sometimes you have to use those tools to make it happen. And so our one story turned into a series of stories and turned into a special, because we were really shining a light on this that wasn't talked about. We kind of were ahead of the curve, and I'm happy about that, because it wasn't being talked about on a national, national conversation. It might have been happening in local newsrooms like, in San Francisco and Los Angeles, where there's a hotbed of Asian Americans. But on a national scale, it wasn't being talked about. So I'm proud to say it, one of the first, because we were aggressive about it. And a lot of that is not just building trust with the community, but building trust within your own newsroom, because I'm not always a squeaky wheel. So if I am a squeaky wheel, then you should be listening.
That's so good. And the power that you're talking about of vulnerability, because we so often ask the people we interview to be vulnerable with us. There's also power in us sharing some of our truths too. Tracy, what about you when it comes to looking for underreported stories and pitches, and also maintaining trust?
Right. So some of the stories we try to push through are really the most difficult stories to tell, the stories that it's really hard to break through. And I'll give you some examples. We spend our time talking to people in the community, as Guad and Chiara said, It's establishing trust to understand what story they feel isn't being told. So rather than us dropping in and saying, this is your story, they're telling us this is their story. And we're playing the long game, and we're letting them come to us once they trust us. And so it is establishing trust and breaking through the misinformation, disinformation that they're used to with the media. So one such story was involving prisoners, and it was involving prisoners in Texas, mostly Black males. And they were suffering and dying from excessive heat. And this is a story that wasn't being told, and a story that most people didn't want to tell. And so we had to really just, show that regardless of how they got there and what they did, they are humans. And so it took time to push that story through, but we did. We talked to lawyers, we talked to family members, and really got people to pay attention to what's happening. This is a human story, and people were dying in prison, and some of them were dying and they haven't even been convicted yet. We're waiting trial. And so, we ended up getting it through on a podcast and getting it through on MSNBC and other outlets. And so those are some of the difficult stories that we know need to be told. And it's just, we're really mindful of the pitch. We're building up of who story we're telling, why this is important, who are the characters, who are the voices, the whys, the who's, the whats, and that this isn't just an isolated problem to Texas, it's happening around the country. So, we kind of come with a full package of the facts and get people to pay attention.
So good, so good. And as we're starting to wrap up, Belén, I do want to ask you, how do you stay connected with communities beyond when you have an assignment and beyond the story, especially at the local level, when I imagine you might run into some folks more often?
Yeah, for sure. So at the local level, I take my personal cards everywhere. I used to give them out to everybody just in case they needed to reach out to me. After covering stories, they have my contact information. They can contact me anytime when it's, kind of the regular day-to-day story. When we're dealing with people that has been through trauma, experienced a hard situation, I would stay in touch by, probably text message or calls, kind of seeing, for example, just to pinpoint an example, I had this mom who opened up to me about her transgender kid being killed outside at Chick-fil-A. It was a very tragic story, and we wanted to know what was police doing about it because she felt she was forgotten. I kind of stay in touch with her, texting hey, what is up? Do they have any suspects or anything? And that led us to an investigation as of how many of the homicides in Houston ended up with the arrest of a suspect. And I think when you go and meet these people, you are a journalist, but you're also human, right? So anything that you can do to make them feel that you are with them, that you are feeling with them, their pain, their grief, any kind of giving them the hand, just a little bit tap on the shoulder, something that would show them, you're telling me your story, I appreciate, I see your grief, and we're gonna do this together. That for me always worked in the sense of, because I'm connecting. I mean, sometimes, it's hard, but I remember my first interview with one of with a woman that had also lost her son they beat him to death. It was horrible. I cried with my interviewee, just forgetting. I mean, I know you have to do the questions, but also feeling for them and getting yourself in their shoes, and not, just stay in touch with them to see what is being done on their cases. I think it's very important. It's just it defines us not only as journalists, but as human beings.
Absolutely. I mean, your remarks are reminding me of how Jose Diaz-Balart ends his broadcast. Thank you for the privilege of your time, remembering as journalists that getting to talk to people is a privilege, and we're people too. I want to end with a question to all of you. We got a comment. Someone said, being a journalist sounds hard. And I think we can all attest to that. And I'm mindful that, all of us are representing different communities, and you could say we're under this umbrella of underrepresented communities. So just in a sentence, since we are low on time here, what's your final thought or piece of advice for reporting on or spending time with communities of color? But specifically, if you are not a person of color or you're not in this community, what's your advice for that? Let's start with you, Belén, and then we'll go around.
So for me, it's the sense of I am, as Guadalupe said, I was considered an alien. I became a US citizen, like a month ago. So I've seen all the alien, I've dealt through things with them. I still don't know many things about the system in America. So I feel like sometimes even if they don't see me as, I didn't have the same immigration path that they had, I tend to sympathize on all the things we have in common, which is, I'm here and I'm struggling as much as you do, trying to sort my way out in this system. And I'm going to do the work, and I'm going to help you out in the meanwhile with the resources that I have and that I got to get along the way.
Thank you. Guad?
I'll take on that common ground Belén mentioned. Remember, we can always find common ground with anyone, even if it's a person you don't like. At some point, there's common ground. Always look for that common ground, and keep in mind that America is diverse. We are all different colors. We speak different languages, and we have communities that don't look like the one we came from or you came from. And unfortunately, what we see in mainstream media does not reflect accurately what we have in America. And keep in mind that as journalists, we have an opportunity to go into these communities and talk about these stories. And it's one of the only opportunities that these communities get. It's through the news, because that's, they're marginalized, they're underserved. And we have an opportunity to help with that by bringing truth and telling their stories, because ultimately my goal, and journalists that care about this, along with becoming a better intercultural communicator, is to show the world that America is much more colored and diverse than most people think it is. Even though we know it's diverse, it's a lot more diverse than what we know it to be in mainstream media.
Thank you so much. Chiara?
Yeah, I sometimes forget even that how my perspective might be different. And shout out to the NBC News Associates program for giving me a shot, because sometimes when I pitch a story or I book my characters for a story, whether it's, oh, surprise, the epidemiologist we have in Nightly News tonight is a tribal member, like sneak that in there. Sometimes I don't even realize how that represents or is a reflection of who I am and what a privilege that is. But so that actually can be an asset, having senior producers say, I never thought about that like that. That is one of our strengths. But I would just say, in terms of advice, you really just have to do the work. If you're assigned a story in a tribal community and you're going to call, the chairman of the tribe, if there is one, you have to treat that like you're calling the head of a sovereign state, and you need to do your homework. What is the governance like? What is their landmass? What are their traditions? We have a guide that we'll share about covering tribal nations that goes through some of those checkpoints. But yeah, there's no substitute for doing your homework in advance, I think.
Thank you so much. And I'm actually going to swap the final question, Tracy and Jamie, for you, given the news of today and this week. How do you take care of yourselves amid these news cycles? We got a couple of questions from the audience on that. Jamie, let's start with you.
Listen, the news has been hard. This week was really, really hard. I went from working on an assignment where we highlighted the achievements of Asian Americans on Friday. We shot with some amazing trailblazers. And from Friday to 24 hours later, hearing about this mass shooting in Monterey Park, you kind of take a moment to sort of be a journalist and compartmentalize. I have to gather the facts, because at the end of the day, truth matters in what we do. And then later, that's when I can find time to be human. Maybe it's having that glass of wine, or maybe a bottle of wine. And maybe it's just unplugging, but it's really, really important for all of us, and I'm guilty of it, to unplug. I was like glued to the TV on Sunday. I couldn't get enough. And then I realized, you know what, this isn't healthy, and I need to stop and just walk away and go do yoga. Or find another community of people to talk about and talk it out. But that's sort of how you escape. We all have to. At the end of the day, I think everyone's kind of touched on it. We're all human, and we are all better together. This intersectionality of all our identities, whether you're Hispanic or Black or Asian American, we're all human. We all want the same things. We just want to live our lives, bring food to the table, raise our kids, and be safe. And it goes away across the board.
Thank you so much, Jamie. And Tracy, I'm not going to change the question on you because Jamie did that so well. How do you avoid becoming, I know you run the Racial Equality Justice Unit, how do you avoid becoming the go-to person? How do you equip people to also inform themselves?
Well, part of it is we encourage being the go-to, but we flip that and, ask people questions. We don't want it to be come to us for something that you could have looked up yourself. So if people do come to us for something really easy, we kind of guide them back to doing the work, but we do want people to come to us with questions, that they're unsure about, so that they're not going on air with something that's, culturally insensitive. And so, it is a kind of a double-edged sword where we are here for that very reason, for people to come to us, but still encourage people to do the work for themselves. And, I'm happy to say most platforms are, and most people are. And I think NBC, I'm really proud to be here because across the board, NBC is doing a great job. Definitely could, always improve, but I think people across the board are really doing the work.
Amazing. Well, thank you all so much for doing the work and being a part of this panel. I'm going to ask you to turn off your cameras now as I introduce our next guest, Yvette Miley, NBC News Group Senior Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and John Silva, the Director of Professional Community Learning at the News Literacy event. I know Chiara's video is getting muted here. Thank you, John and Yvette, for being with us. I think a big theme throughout this, just the importance of being authentic in the reporting, but also knowing that no community is a monolith. I saw a question about plurality. So Yvette, if you could speak about the mission of NBC Academy, that's why we're all here, and why it's important for NBCU to be a part of this event.
NBCU Academy exists. It's my job in terms of the diversity, equity, and inclusion team. It's our signature brand to provide continuous learning and development for people who want access and opportunity within media. But it's also something deeply personal to me. Bias and barriers to entry exist. I face them. So it is our job, but we get great joy, all of us on the team, providing access and opportunity and informing, educating, inspiring, and motivating people on their journey of development. So that's why NBCU Academy exists. We provide scholarship grants to students. We have on our website, NBCUacademy.com, anyone can log on and have access to experts who are teaching and sharing. You're on there as well. And that's what it's about, being able to connect with people who are doing the job, or in the roles, or in the chair that you want to one day occupy. So that's what NBCU Academy is about. And we're thrilled. We just launched our Fundamentals of Journalism course as well, where anyone can log on and go through our Fundamentals of Journalism course. It's a great team. It's passion work. It's purposeful work. And that's why NBCU Academy exists, to provide access and opportunity.
Thank you, Yvette. And briefly, I also just want to ask you how our news organization works to maintain public trust in the climate that we're in.
Public trust, I think, has always been an issue for the media. And that is because so many communities are othered and outside the scope of what we do. If you were to do an audit of newscasts 10 years ago, you would find people who look like me at the top of the newscast and at the bottom. Crime victim or suspect in the lead story. And then, oh, wow, incredible, making a difference person. Can you believe that this person survived their neighborhood and now got a scholarship to Harvard? Like you never existed anywhere else. So I think trust has to be won by individual journalists, one at a time. And that is, two types of journalists exist, in my opinion, and I've shared this before: those who feel entitled to public trust and those who earn it. As a journalist, you got to earn it. And you can't just say, hey, because I show up, because I landed at NBC, when I go into that neighborhood, they are absolutely, I have their trust. One quick example, the vaccine, there was vaccine hesitancy in terms of, and people were always talking about how that hesitancy was with communities of color. And I said, well, let's just find the context as to why that might be. What happened with Tuskegee Airmen? What happened with the Tuskegee experiments? What happened where we felt brutalized and not listened to by medical professionals? And then you're gonna now expect this community to have automatic trust. You got to earn it. And I think every day, every story, every assignment, each individual journalist has to earn that trust. And that is how I think we get there. Every story counts. Every story counts and matters to earning the trust as a collective industry.
Absolutely. It takes time. I bet, Miley, thank you so much. And John Silva, I want to bring you in and end with you. Again, Director of Professional Community Learning at the News Literacy Project. Thank you for having us be a part of this. Any final words for our audience?
I just want to, on behalf of NLP, just express my deepest gratitude to all the amazing professionals from NBCU that have been working with us today and sharing their knowledge with educators. This has been an incredible day for the educators that have joined us. The NLP staff have been watching in the background. We've all learned a lot, and hoping this is the start of an important ongoing relationship with educators who are now wanting to do this, and hopefully we can make some further connections between NLP, but also NBCU Academy. So Yvette, thank you so much for everything. Also to Amnika for all her help in helping getting people lined up. The day's not over. We still have 2 more sessions today. We're continuing in this theme here, starting in a few minutes, talking about harm and distrust, why communities of color often have misgivings about mainstream news. Part of that is going to be an introduction to our newest lesson in the Checkology virtual classroom, which focuses on the history of harm and distrust. And so we have another panel going on there. And
John,
if you missed,
John, if I could, I just want to take a moment to thank you and educators. It was a teacher who told me that I could live beyond my block, who encouraged me to read, who said, hey, you like to write. Have you ever thought about being a journalist? I had no idea what that was, but it was an educator who took time to see me, to hear me, and to encourage me. So thank you, John. Thank you to all the educators, because you're on the front lines and you matter. You absolutely matter. You matter.
thank you so much, Yvette. Okay, so the next session starts in about 3-ish minutes. You can find the link to that on our agenda page. And then one final reminder, if you missed the morning session on what it means to be news literate, the session that I did talking about some of the big concepts, that will be at 4:30 Eastern time. It's a repeat of the morning session. So if you didn't catch that in the morning, you can join us. So thank you, everyone, for joining the session. This was amazing. The recording will be available with all the others sometime next week. You'll see the follow-up email. So enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully you're going to continue the learning with us this afternoon.